9. Trial. Our Doris has been charged with GBH and public indecency. After she was arrested for attacking Janice Dooley of Little Street, she forewent her lawyer's advice to keep her mouth shut, and told the police she said, "If you'd have been a few minutes later, I'd have made sure she'd never set foot in Partridge Mews again, let alone Little Street." Luckily, Ira Murgatroyd, the lawyer, told them that she was still hyped up after all the adrenaline distress caused by Janice, and our Doris isn't facing a charge of attempted murder. She wasn't happy when she found out they were releasing her and keeping Janice Dooley in police custody, as this was her third arrest in as many weeks. Apparently, Janice has been going after members of the Partridge Mews Women's Institute. Renee Thomason barely got away with her eyebrows after Janice snuck into the beauticians and applied depilatory cream instead of hot wax. Our Doris had spent long enough in a cell anyway. Her clothes were taken as evidence and she were brought to me in a grey tracksuit. I said to her, "Let's get you home." And she didn't reply as I led her towards the car. Once we got home, I went straight through to the kitchen and heard our Doris pottering about upstairs. Her footsteps hushed as she slipped into the bathroom and locked the door. When I heard the bath start up with a rush of water that could have blown up the immersion, I knew our Doris was planning something. I did what all red-blooded northerners do in those situations. I went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. When our Doris has guests around, she brings out the teapot. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and I took the 2 matching blue mugs out of the top cupboard and planted tea bags in each of them. I added sugar to mine and went into a debate about our Doris. Did spending a night in a police cell count as shock? I didn't find an answer, but 3 heaped spoonfuls of the sweet stuff found its way into our Doris's mug. Then, like the number 12 bus, all my dilemmas arrived at once. I opened the fridge and made the unwelcome discovery that we were out of milk. As a newcomer to Bulgebusters, our Doris decided that milk, no matter the variety, full fat, semi-skimmed, skimmed, soya, almond, coconut, hazelnut, it could come from the left nipple of a fat-free platypus, and our Doris, ever diligent where her weight was concerned, wouldn't have it near her fridge. Not that week in any case. Our Doris would spend the best part of an hour in the bath. She's mastered the art over the last 50 years. I once said to her, "No wonder you've got so many wrinkles, the amount of time you spend underwater." She glanced at me from under her towel turban, and it were but a glance when she said to me, "No wonder you've got hemorrhoids, the amount of time you spend on the toilet." When you've been married for a few months, you come to the realisation the only time you'll ever get is when you're in the bathroom. I'd mastered the art of finishing crosswords, tax returns, Tom Clancy's, making holiday plans and polishing, all from the comfort of our Twyford's toilet. Being able to hide sounded preferable to going out into Partridge Mews. Getting my coat from the hook by the front door, I could envisage Indigo down the corner shop, daughter of Sandra Marsden, who went through a well-documented rebellious stage in her 20s that resulted in the closure of the Partridge Mews YMCA. She'd ask after our Doris, all fluttering false eyelashes and swathes of sheer fabric that look as though she's robbed a haberdashery. And she'd say to me, gleaning information to tell her grandmother down the home, she'd say to me, "As the Mrs. Mr. Copeland?" And I'd have to think carefully about my answer, because anything I said would ultimately come back on our Doris, and then word would reach our Doris and she'd corner me in the kitchen. But that couldn't be helped, not with the current milk situation. Neither could the 5 people who stood on the step as I opened the front door. Assembled before me like knights of the round table stood our Angela, Theo, Alf and his Edith, and Violet Grey, all with an assortment of food, from fresh baked pastries from Dennings, Tesco pork pies and a picnic basket with a baguette spear to what I saw underneath Alf's arm. He saw me look and raised it with a twinkle in his eye. "You've been out all night and I weren't scuppering me chances of a brew." I said to them, and there were a mild lift in me heart that wasn't angina, I said, "What are you all here for?" Violet Grey handed me the picnic basket, all regal aplomb, and she said to me, "Doris has been my dear friend for over half a century. She helped me when Miss Dooley tried to besmirch my husband's character, and I will help her in this. I brought all the ingredients for a correct bruschetta, And forgive me for being stoically British. A picnic. There should be enough sandwiches to make do. I didn't know what to say. There were no words left in my throat. I was choked up. I'd never had to cope with Violet Grey on my own before. And out of nowhere, our Theo took the picnic basket from me and turned to Violet, all smiles, his braces doing this funny thing in the sun, and he said to her, I am sure my grandfather would issue you with the correct compliments as befitting a man of his social standing, but you can understand that he has been through a great shock. Please follow us through to the kitchen where we can peruse your most delectable dishes. I should hope we will do much more than peruse them, but I appreciate the sentiment all the same. She followed our Theo, Angela and Edith into the kitchen, leaving me stood there with Elf. He winked at me and said, that grandson of yours should go into politics. With a tongue like that, he'll give your Doris a run for her money. I wasn't sure how they would help our Doris, but one thing was for sure, I'd need to find that teapot. Once we'd settled into the kitchen, teacups full, me halfway through a pork pie, our Doris came into the room. She'd clearly heard all the commotion, dressed in a floral print dress and pastel blue blazer, with a scarf around her throat, but not tied. It's an outfit she still doesn't think she's mastered, the wasn't expecting visitors look, because our Doris is always ready for any possible Partridge Mews resident to knock at the door. She considered installing CCTV once just to make sure no undesirables walked along her garden path. Now she stood there, faced the picture of a woman acknowledging her mistakes, all meek smiles and a bit of a twinkle in her eyes that aired caution and didn't veer into triumphant. And she said to us, it fills my heart to know that our family and friends would gather at such a traumatic time. It will be no secret in the town that I have committed a crime. I did. Yesterday morning I attacked Janice Dooley of Little Street at a Bulgebusters meeting taking place at the church hall. I do not regret my actions. I fully intended to harm Miss Dooley, and if the opportunity arose, would happily do so again, for she is nothing if not a stain on this society. However, I know that the best attacks I can make are that of the verbal variety, and therefore I ask that you help me in this difficult time. Violet Grey rose to her feet, wiping her fingers clean on the handkerchief she unleashed from under her sleeve. She set her hand on our Doris's shoulder and said to her, Now listen here, Mrs. Copeland. You and I have been through much in this fair town of ours. I never for one moment believed that Erin Beaumont would name her child Red, but she did. Yet we managed to get his name changed through several letters to the Partridge Mews Gazette and a campaign that saw Granada report on the Beaumont's doorstep. Janice Dooley of Little Street, we all agree, is a menace that must be stopped. We have the people of Partridge Mews behind us. We managed to eradicate Bartholomew Wick's ridiculous hairstyle. You will receive a minimal sentence, Mrs. Copeland, I promise you that. Silence fell in the kitchen. Never before had we seen Violet Grey as forthright. I thought she must have ruined 70+ years' worth of keeping her nose in the air and her lips pursed. I'm sure I saw her wrinkles burst on her face, deep tracks treading through her face as though her oil of Olay had stopped working. Our Doris offered Violet something like a smile and said to her, What about the garden safari? What of it? Violet said. You made an impassioned speech at Janice Dooley's abdication, and I will value that now as I uphold the offer you received of the 5th house in our final garden safari. If our Doris had ever had eyes wider, it within the 5 minutes I left the room while she were in labour. Her eyes practically left their sockets. You could have used them for golf, they were that prominent, and she said to Violet, What do you mean? Final garden safari? Violet smiled meekly, and I realised that this served them both somehow. Violet had something planned, and she weren't telling us about it. That must have been why she was being so kind. She tried it once in 1972 when me and our Doris were talking about getting a conservatory. Started being kind, brought around the odd quiche, and over time intimated that weren't conservatories a bit lower middle class. Our Doris, ever want to be decidedly upper class, decided we didn't need a conservatory as it would ruin the charm of our otherwise splendid Victorian home. 2 weeks later, the Greys put in plans for a conservatory, and we saw neither hide nor hair of Violet Grey until she invited us around to celebrate the erection of her conservatory, an event we had to attend as it was the height of the social calendar that year. Now in the kitchen, we were all on tenterhooks. Alf's pork pie dripped piccalilli onto the counter, and Edith didn't hastily swipe it away with a convenient dishcloth. Theo had stopped live tweeting the conversation, his phone that close to his coffee it was almost a spoon. Angela's eyes darted from Our Doris to Violet and back again, her mouth opening and closing as though she were eating a phantom donut. And Violet Grey was proud here. She'd got her head tilted just so, and her shoulders were back, her hands closed across her stomach, the picture of Princess Anne, and she said to Our Doris, a declaration to us all, she said, "The committee has spoken and decided that this year will serve as the last garden safari due to the surrounding controversy." I turned away from the crushed pork pie and Alf's hand and looked at Our Doris. I should have kept my eyes where they were. I could have stopped him. Instead, I sat and watched as several pork pies and tablespoons of piccalilli hit Violet Grey in the back of the head. She spun around to see how Angela, Theo, Edith and Alf stood there, all bearing arms, and Alf's eyes were wild. He looked like Wurzel Gummidge having a seizure, and he said to her, he practically yelled, he said, "We all know what's going on here. The garden safari hasn't been the big success you'd hoped. Not enough people care about traipsing around the posh end of Partridge Mews in the hopes of seeing how far up your bazovas your bleeding heads are. If they want to see things that acrobatic, they turn on Britain's Got Talent. Well, I can tell you something now, Mrs. Grey. You are not blaming Our Doris for your mess. Your garden safari failed because of your poor management." Violet Grey tried to maintain a decorum as a blob of piccalilli slipped down her shoulders. Said to Alf, she said, "I'll have you know that I've managed many successful events in Partridge Mews." "I'm afraid that's not quite right, is it, Mrs. Grey?" Edith ran her hands under the tap as she spoke, all hints of her crime washed away. She said to Violet, she said, "You use other people to your own gains. You're all about delegating rather than the actual work. Mrs. Copeland here has arranged more galas, tea dances and sports days than you've arranged excuses for your husband's whereabouts." She smiled here, and I realised that I didn't give Edith the credit she was due. She continued, she said, "But we're not here to discuss your husband's infidelities. We're here to help Mrs. Copeland with the planning for her upcoming court case. If we hear of any excuses of controversy, we will see to it that the people of Partridge Mews believe the controversy stems from the breakdown of your marriage." "Mrs. Simpson, I assure you my marriage is not breaking down." "I do not disagree with you, Mrs. Grey. However, we have steered clear of discussing Mr. Grey's whereabouts in the streets. We have yet to mention the slight hints of sherry on your breath. Janice Dooley planted a seed we have not acknowledged, but blame Mrs. Copeland, Violet, and I will ensure it takes root." Violet didn't let the silence linger. She looked Our Doris straight in the eye and said to her, she said, "I will leave the few foodstuffs I brought as a gift to you. I'll telephone to intimate collection details for the basket." After a fleeting glance around the room, she added, she said, "Enjoy it while you can." She left. Our Doris and I exchanged a look that only a husband and wife can share. Over the next few hours we made plans. Theo thought that he could get Our Doris's side of the story on film and post it to YouTube. Our Angela thought the best bet would be for Our Doris to appear all over the place doing nice deeds, having conversations with folk she doesn't usually talk to. Alf considered pulling off an even bigger crime to draw more attention to himself, but Edith thought that had ruined their grandson's chances of a promotion. Once they'd left, I locked the door, faced Our Doris and said to her, I said, "If that's the best we've got, Our Doris, you're beggared." Our Doris gave me the look and said to me, she said, "I bleeding well know that, our Harold, but someone had to put Violet Grey in her place, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be you, was it? There's nothing I can say now that'll get her back on side. It's a good job this is my forte. Our first plan of action is to get me on the front page of the Partridge Mews Gazette. I'll telephone them now." Now, I hate being the bearer of bad news, but I said to her, I said, "You attacked a reporter, Our Doris. They'll revel in this, they will." Our Doris' shoulders slumped and she leant in the doorframe of the kitchen, and I wasn't prepared. I hadn't seen Our Doris cry since her great-aunt Ida's funeral, and there she stood in the doorway, her back trembling as she cried, using a scarf as a mop, and she said to me, she said, I'm not made for this, Arnold. I'm Doris Copeland. I'm supposed to be a pillar of the community and I'm a laughing stock. I had my arms around her shoulders and led her into the sitting room. I said to her, and I think it was our marital vows that saved me, I said, "You did wrong, Our Doris. There's no getting past that. We don't need the Gazette. We have the WI. We have the boys down the allotment. We have Partridge Mews. Janice Dooley has Little Street. And since when has that done anyone any good?" Our Doris sniffed once more, and she said to me, and there were a glint of something in her eye, she said, "That might be the smartest thing you ever said, Harold Copeland." We sat there a few more minutes, her leaning against my shoulder in a fashion we hadn't tried since our courting days down the flicks, and I said to her, I said, "We best get to work then." The next morning, I woke up to find Our Doris on the phone. She doesn't usually let me sleep in, claims that it leads to an unwarranted takeover of the duvet, and she didn't spend 50 years of marriage not to create a fair distribution of the bedsheets. I kept my eyes shut and listened to Our Doris downstairs as she put the phone back in its cradle and climbed the stairs. She opened the bedroom door and said to me, she said, "Get yourself up, Harold. I know you're awake. You're not breathing like a hippopotamus is sat on your chest. Anyway, our Murgatroyd just rang. My trial is next week. The judge had an opening, apparently." It was a nonchalance that got me. I flung myself out of bed and said to her, I said, "Next week? How are we meant to get the Gazette on side by then?" Since Our Doris's outburst with the secateurs, the editor of the Partridge Mews Gazette had taken to responding to each and every missive Our Doris sent his way. When she questioned Tiffany Bethnal's use of braised Philadelphia as an hors d'oeuvre, he commented, "He wrote for all the world to see." Editor's note. Although Mrs. Copeland may raise a valid point about high-calorie foodstuffs at children's school discos, she herself served a prawn cocktail starter in the early 2000s, a move that was seen by some as nostalgic and by others as woefully behind the times, quoted verbatim from Mrs. Pandra O'Malley's article in 2002's June 25th edition. Of course, Our Doris continued to send her letters. I said to her, I said, "Why don't you write to the Courier instead?" That got me the look, and she said to me, she said, "I wouldn't use the Courier to puppy train an Alsatian. It's a rag, no substance, no merit, and you do well to remember that, Harold." And she stuck with the Gazette. I didn't think too much about any form of grovelling, but Our Doris said to me, and I suppose it were obvious really, she said, "They won't outwardly discredit me, Harold. I am their most consistent contributor since little Billy Earl. They'd be mad to turn their back on me." When we went downstairs, we weren't prepared for the newspaper on the mat. Our Doris was on the front page of the Partridge Mews Gazette laying into Janice Dooley. The headline weren't pretty. "Mrs. Copeland's Graveyard Brawl." I thought Our Doris would issue a retort. I looked for the defiant set of her shoulders, the gleam in her eye, her clenched fist, but there were none of that. Our Doris clapped her hands to her sides and she said, "Well, that's that then." I retrieved the newspaper and followed her into the kitchen, reading as I went. The paper were claiming that the day's issue revealed the innermost secrets of the town's most distinguished citizens. I said to Our Doris, I said, "You must have really upset them, Our Doris." "Of course I bleeding upset them, Harold. I attacked one of their reporters with a dictionary and a pair of secateurs. What's surprising is that they haven't got Janice Dooley of bleeding Little Street as a page 3 girl offering an exclusive on her side of the story." After a quick flick to the third page, I made a brew. I said to Our Doris, I said, "There's still the lads down the allotment, and you have—" I stopped there. I could not believe my eyes. In 50 years of marriage to Our Doris, I never expected to witness what I saw emblazoned on pages 5 and 6. Our Doris had the look she gets when I'm shifty, the old quirked eyebrow, and she said to me, she said, "What is it, Harold?" My lips were positively trembling as I said it, because the cat were out of the bag. The big secret had been revealed. Violet's revealed Doug's affair. Our Doris were furious. The Greys had surpassed us again. It took Our Doris most of the day to calm down. After lunch, she muttered something inaudible, but altogether she were that angry she were rendered mute. Then, when I were just settling down to watch Tipping Point, she said to me, she said, "I don't know whether it's an act of friendship or Violet refusing to let us have a hold over her." I must have looked startled as I said to her, I said, "How can it be an act of friendship, Our Doris? Because if she cancels due to controversy, folk will assume it's due to her marital breakdown, but it could be a way of her having all control. You forget, Harold, it's all how folk see something. They're not seeing a woman wronged, they're seeing a woman who couldn't get her husband to stay faithful. I said to her, but it's not her fault. She shrugged at me and said, it'll be seen as the ultimate failure. I don't know why she did it. I didn't have to wait long to find out. I'd bobbed down to the Hare and Horse to have a few drinks with Alf when Violet Grey appeared sentry-like, looking every inch Diana Karenina. She stood over our table and she said to Alf, Alfred, I wonder whether you might go and purchase me a beverage. I'm quite accustomed to a gin and tonic. Take your time. And she handed him a £20 note. A £20 note. No one hands £20 notes to Alf because Lord knows they'll never see the change. And as he ran to the bar, she sat down in his seat and met my eyes. I said to her, you shouldn't have done that. Violet Grey shrugged and set her hands on the table. She still wore her wedding ring. She said to me, I need to discuss some things with you, Mr. Copeland. I'm not sure our Doris would be too happy to hear we've been chatting. And she said to me, this concerns Mrs. Copeland. You will have seen the big reveal in the newspaper, no doubt. I slurped my bitter and nodded. Bit of a bold move, wasn't it? I said to her. Her gaze dropped then and she said, I have good reason. You see, Mr. Copeland, I am leaving Partridge Mews. The pub was silent. Violet had chosen me because she and our Doris were pillars of the community, and today both of them had fallen into disrepute. Everyone would be listening to hear any iota of gossip, and I, Harold Copeland, resident of Partridge Mews, who can never seem to get a day's peace, would have to be a means to an end. I thought to myself, what would our Doris do? And straightened my spine, though I was sure that uncoiling my vertebrae might set my arthritis on edge. I straightened my cardigan and I said to Violet, I suppose that Doug won't be coming with you. She shook her head. You're a man, Mr. Copeland. You'll never understand. However, my departure means that the Partridge Mews Women's Institute will require a new chairwoman, and I would like for your wife, Mrs. Copeland, to be my successor. I must have been gobsmacked. The hush of whispers filled the pub. Alf stood at the bar waiting for the gin and tonic, and I sat staring at Violet. I said to her, and I was completely dumbfounded, I said, but the court case? I know the judge. Mrs. Copeland cannot be given too serious a sentence, and the WI will see that she was provoked by one who you will note is still in a cell. I needed enough controversy to draw attention away from her. I hope you can understand. She stood up and crossed the pub, took her drink from Alf and brought it to her lips before handing it back and saying to him, do you know, I've had the sudden revelation that alcohol can be ruinous. Please enjoy this drink on behalf of myself and my former partner, Douglas. And, with a final fleeting glance at the Hare and Horse, Violet Grey left the pub and Partridge Mews. She'll have gone to visit her sister, our Doris said to me when I got home. I'd given her all the information as soon as I'd arrived, making sure she'd taken a seat in the lounge and kept anything breakable away from her throwing arm. I had sweet tea in my hand and said to her, you don't seem surprised, our Doris. When have you ever known Violet Grey to court controversy? Even when she caught her stilettos in her gypsy skirt at the Easter tea dance in 1973, she intimated that she'd always meant to make the faux pas so people could see she was a normal human being. She's spoken to your judge, our Doris. I thought she might. Do you want to talk about it? She sat for a moment before saying to me, I've decided that we do not need the support of Partridge Mews to help lessen my sentence. I committed a crime and will pay the consequences. Which is exactly what she told the judge the following week. She dressed in her best prim old lady, beige two-piece suit and flat black plimsolls with a hint of gold to the buckle. After paying a visit to the salon, she now had a rejuvenated perm and wore delicate makeup so as to give off the air of one who still wants to look their best even in adversity. In this case, adversity in the form of Janice Dooley of Little Street, who gave a raving tale of how our Doris behaved like a crazed madwoman, and it were only through sheer wit that she managed to escape. She hadn't counted on our Doris. She never does. It is a mistake Janice has always made that she never anticipates our Doris's attack. The judge said to her, Mrs. Copeland, you have pled guilty. Do you have anything to say? She nodded and said to her, she said, Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Your Honour. Though you had no need to do so, I appreciate it all the same. I must offer my utmost apologies to Miss Dooley and to the citizens of Partridge Mews for my less than exceptional behaviour. I let Miss Dooley antagonise me when I should have taken the moral high ground and left the church hall. I deeply regret my actions, and thank the Partridge Mews Women's Institute for not losing faith in me and offering me the role of chairwoman. It is not a reward for my wrongdoing, but a reminder that I am better than this trial would have many believe, and mean much more to many of the women in this town. I let the unimportant words of an unimportant person affect me, and for that I am incredibly sorry. Thank you. Janice Dooley's plum face set off her neck brace brilliantly. Her arms were folded, and she must have worked on her scowl because she had the face of a bulldog. The judge coughed through the chatter in the gallery, and she said to Our Doris, she said, Mrs. Copeland, you committed a serious crime against Miss Dooley, and though I believe you truly regret your actions and that you have the support of Partridge Mews at this difficult time, I still must award you some penalty. Therefore, I sentence you to 100 hours of community service, the terms of which will be decided at a later date. For now, I wish you all the best in your endeavours. Our Doris's smile couldn't have been bigger. Her teeth practically shone as she sidled across the room and said to me, she said, One trial over, one more to go. I said to her, What do you mean, Our Doris? She said to me, she said, The garden safari, of course. A gift to the people of Partridge Mews for their support in this trying time. I'm not sure Our Doris recognised she'd been sentenced. Her head were in the clouds. In 2 weeks, she'd managed to rid herself of 2 enemies, attacked Janice Dooley of Little Street, and succeeded as chairwoman of the WI. There was no way she was going to let something as trivial as community service bring her down.